Welcome to You Can Talk to Me, a Beatles podcast. It's time to make our way across the universe and talk all things John, Paul, George and Ringo.
Jim, thank you for joining me here on the podcast. Great to finally sit with you and talk all things Dylan and Beatles.
Thanks for having me on, Mike. I really appreciate it.
We were just talking a moment ago before we started, and since the release of the book, and we're certainly going to talk about where the music had to go, how Bob Dylan and the Beatles changed each other and the world. So looking forward to that. But you've been out there everywhere at the moment. How have you found the reception? I saw that we had the highly respected Beatles author Kenneth Womack has a lovely, succinct piece at the start of the book there, and simply says it's a revelation. You must be happy with the reception the book's getting.
Yeah, it's getting it's had good reviews in the early the trade publications that review books in advance of the mainstream publications. They were all good. I got a good one in Mojo, and today the Wall Street Journal had a good review, so I'm very happy with that. And Ken's been great. I spoke at his last Beatles conference in Asbury Park, New Jersey, and I spoke up there. This was long before the book came out. I talked about Dylan and the Beatles in 1965. That was my topic for the time of it was an anniversary of Rubber Soul conference. So I talked about their interactions at that time.
Oh, well, congratulations. I think we get a launch here in Australia April 14. So at the time of this recording, we're only days out from that. So that's very exciting as well for us here and the Australian fans. Before we dive into the book, can we go back in time? I'm always fascinated by the motivation for people to do the thing they do. Were you aware at a young age that journalism was going to be the thing you would commit your life to?
Pretty much. I didn't know if it was going to be journalism or other kinds of writing, but I kind of joke that nothing's changed for me since I was a teenager, because in high school I was the editor of our school newspaper, and I also played in garage bands at the time. So it's always been journalism and music. It's just those are the two main things, and so it's continued to the present day. So yeah, I guess I had an idea. I was always writing even before high school. So
yeah, where did that inspiration come from, a writing perspective?
I don't know. I just was a big reader, and as a little kid, and loved all kinds of books, and at the same time becoming a big music fan, and they kind of happened at the same time. So and I remember the first rock music book I read. I was 12 years old. For some reason, I found a little paperback about the Who, and I found it so fascinating to read. It's like and from then on, I just I got deeper and deeper into Dylan and Beatles books. And the one thing I kept noticing was that when they met each other or crossed paths, sometimes the story didn't have enough detail, or it seemed a bit confused, and different books disagree with each other on basic facts. So that's where when I started looking into this, I thought at first it might be just an article, but the more I got into it, I was like, oh, I think there's enough here for a book.
There's a moment there where I've heard you recently describe that for many people, you were either in a Dylan camp or a Beatles camp. It was very hard to kind of find a fusion between the two. I came to Dylan late and had a bit of a bumpy time locking in to Dylan. And how I was able to do it was through the Beatles. The Beatles came into my life at a young age and kind of filled it up. And the more I got to understand more deeply their process, the love that George particularly had for him, I started to think, okay, maybe I'm missing something here. And then slowly but surely I came to him. Who came first for you? And did either one bring you a hallway to the other?
For me, first, it was solo Beatles. So I was a kid of the 70s. So when Uncle Albert Admiral Halsey came out, I don't know how that was in Australia. That was a number one hit in America. In Britain, it wasn't a big hit, I discovered. But, I was a little kid, and that was my entry point. And soon after that, Lennon's like Dream Number 9, also Band on the Run. I had the Lennon compilation Shaved Fish and George Harrison's album 33 and a Third, which I continue to I just think that's such a great record. And I got into Dylan right after that, so I was not until I was 11 or 12 years old. I knew the Beatles and the solo Beatles from, age 5 until then. And Dylan, it wasn't something my parents played in the house or
Mm,
anything like that. So I discovered it through a friend of mine when I was about 12 years old or 11. And also, it was the song Hurricane was on the radio a little bit. Not, it wasn't a big hit, but it was, got in the top 40 in America. And that was a song that really got my attention. And I bought the album Desire and his other album right from that time called Hard Rain, which is a live album of the Rolling Thunder Review tour that there was a documentary about that a couple years ago, and I still love that period of Dylan, but I love all Dylan. So I'm a little different from the '60s fans who really there are some Dylan fans that I think are almost exclusively like the Like a Rolling Stone era and Blonde on Blonde, and I love that stuff too. But I'm a big fan of later Dylan and what he's doing now even. So
mm.
I'm not hung up on his '60s stuff.
Similar to myself, I remember the very first time I saw Dylan and heard him was Hurricane, and I'm a child of the '70s myself. And back in the era when we had music video shows, and I remember
Yeah.
the Sunday afternoon and seeing and hearing Hurricane for the first time and
Oh,
the violin and thinking, what is this?
yeah.
The whole thing just looked like nothing else that I'd heard, and it sounded like nothing else that I'd heard. And that was before I even understood who Dylan even was. But he's always been very much his own thing, hasn't he, with his own mythology.
Yeah, yes, completely. And in a way, they're two great stories. The Dylan story, there's been so many documentaries and the movie last year, A Complete Unknown. In a way, in that way, he's like the Beatles, where I think people can just endlessly think about the Beatles story, and it's so fascinating. And in both cases, there are hundreds of books about each one because it's so deep. You can go endlessly into different periods and details and the characters that come up. So that yeah, that's it.
I think you spoke with Joe Wisby recently. Have you spoken to Joe yet from Beatles Books
Yeah, I
podcast?
did. That
Yeah.
that yes, I did.
Yeah, lovely man. And I think you may have heard me say this before, but he has this wonderful quote that he gave me when I was speaking with him, when I asked him what was it about them for him. And he was just saying that the weeds are endlessly fascinating. If you were to write something on the searches, you may not spend too much time down in the weeds, But if
Yeah.
you get into the weeds of this story, it's endlessly fascinating, and you just keep peeling back layers.
Yeah, it's really true. I mean, there's an album Dylan made in 1997, Time Out of Mind, and this writer named I think John Lewis, not somebody I know, but he wrote a short book only about the making of that album that I think is a self-published book,
Hmm.
but it's one of the things I enjoyed most reading about Dylan. That like even that story is fascinating. It's Dylan's with the producer Danielle Lanois, who
Yeah.
produced U2 and Peter Gabriel, and they get into a lot of arguments and fights. So it's kind of a zesty kind of a read because there's a lot going on, and that's really in a way a lot of people consider that Dylan's comeback album, which
Hmm.
if I think if he hadn't had this great late period, we might not be talking about him as much as we are these days. You know,
Yeah, that's fascinating.
yeah.
Dylan didn't come to the Beatles quickly, did he? I mean, I'm curious if you could just share a little bit of your insights into how he comes to them when they break, and what is the attraction for him.
Yeah, so in like late 1963, early 1964, that's when the Beatles are just starting to break in America. So Dylan heard their like "I Want to Hold Your Hand" and "She Loves You" on pop radio stations, and and talking with friends, he dismissed them as for teeny boppers,
Yeah.
is what he said. But then a month later, he was on a cross country road trip, and he heard them coming over the car radio, and turned to his friend and he said, "Man, did you hear that? That was great." And then so they suddenly made sense to him. And a couple weeks later, he was seen in a cafe in Santa Monica, California, pumping coins into a jukebox to hear "I Want to Hold Your Hand" and "She Loves You" over and over again. It's like as if he was like, uh, you know, studying them. And And then he gave an interview about that moment where he became a convert to the Beatles, and he said, "I realized they were outrageous." He uses the words outrageous and valid, which I think is
Mm.
interesting. And he said they were pointing the music, pointing the way where, pointing the direction where music had to go. And I think for him, the Beatles revived rock and roll. They made it for him into something he could use for to say what he wanted to say. I think in his mind he thought he loved rock and roll when he was a teenager, but he came to think that he could express himself more deeply through what we call folk music, but writing songs in the folk idiom. And he really fell hard for Woody Guthrie and Odetta and other people in the folk world, and kind of became a solo troubadour. He quit, he traded his electric guitar that he had in high school for an acoustic. So but he always had this kind of rock and roll attack even to a lot of his folk stuff. And and then when he heard the Beatles, I think it made him think twice, like, oh, I don't have to be playing on my own anymore. And also, the folk world came with a lot of rules and regulations that he didn't necessarily agree with, about how you should present yourself. And um, he loved all kinds of show business. Dylan is a real, as we know now, because he won't get off the road. He really loves he just loves show business and putting on a show. And I think the genre is a little less important to him than getting out there and expressing himself. Also, I think he didn't want to be cut off from the pop marketplace like that. Like why wouldn't he get a band? And he felt like he was as much a rock and roller as anybody else. And so when he makes that first album with electric instrumentation, bringing it all back home, that's 1964, 65, sorry. Um, he's that even that title is it signifies that he's bringing rock and roll back home to America, away from the British invaders. Because at the time, not only the Beatles, but the Dave Clark Five and all these other groups were in the top 10 in America. And it was a big craze in America, the British invasion. And Dylan was kind of with that title saying, here's how it's actually done, So
Mm.
that's in his, kind of a boast.
I get the feeling too that what perhaps they loved in each other over time was the fact that neither wanted to stay in a box, and both parties were kind of pulling in from everything that had gone before, and not just rock and roll. It was a very diverse melting pot of sounds that was informing their art that I think they shared as they evolved through their lives. I get a sense that was part of the glue.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it would have been boring if the Beatles had just in 63 or 62 if they were just rehashing Chuck Berry and Little Richard, but they weren't. They were bringing in influences from Motown and Ray Charles and the Everlys, and bringing it all together into this kind of new kind of rock and roll. And I think that's what Dylan could hear in it and appreciate it, and realize that, oh, there's another step this music can take. It's going somewhere new with the Beatles, musically. And then he had the idea of, with his first rock and roll single, Subterranean Homesick Blues, of kind of throwing his kind of lyrics onto that structure and sound.
There's a unique way that Paul comes to Dylan through his brother Mike.
It's in the fall of 62, and Paul comes home to Forthland Road in Liverpool, and Mike is playing Dylan's first album on the record player in the house. And Paul hears it, and he's very suspicious, and he's like, "What's that?" And Mike says, "It's a bloke called Bob Dylan," and Paul dismisses it, and he says, "Crap! It's crap! It's folk crap!" And but then it's about 18 months later, when he's in Paris with the other Beatles, they're playing a 3-week engagement at the Olympia Theater, and Paul finds the first Dylan album and his second album, The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, at a radio station, and he takes them back to the hotel, the Georges V, where they're all staying. And that's when, soon after that, Lennon tells Melody Maker, for the rest of the 3 weeks in Paris, we listen to Dylan nonstop. So that's when they all fall for him. There are little things that, like, you can notice. Do you know there's a documentary that of the Beatles' first U.S. visit, and
Yes.
by the Maysles brothers.
Yeah,
And there's
absolutely.
a little scene of there's George is in a hotel room in Miami, and he's playing a thing on guitar, and it's actually a Bob Dylan song, "Talking New York Blues."
I
And
didn't know
so
that.
it's just yeah, so it's just funny when he's just seems to be playing it, and I think he's
Huh.
figured out how to play this "Talking New York Blues." So that's funny. And also, George was fascinated by the cover of the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan by the woman on the cover, who's Dylan's girlfriend at the time, Susie Rodolo. And when the Beatles and Dylan finally meet in New York in 1964, that's George's one of his first questions to Bob is like, who's this person on the cover of the album? And
Who's the
Dylan says, well,
bird?
she's not far from here. Yeah, Dylan had broken up with her by then, but he said she's not far. So George called her from the Delmonico Hotel, and Susie came up with a bunch of her friends from New York's East Village neighborhood and tried to get in, but she couldn't get past all the crowds and the guards, even though George had left her name down at the desk. And she called Dylan from a payphone, or she called the hotel room, and she and Dylan immediately got into an argument on the phone, and she didn't end up going in
Wow.
because she brought some people with her, and Dylan was like, "Why'd you bring people with you? You know, you could have come up yourself." So he thought that was not a cool move by good old Susie, and and, um, and didn't let her come up. So they had a bit of an argument. She went back home, but anyway, they were very much into it. But yeah, when I was watching that Maisley's Brother documentary and George is playing this guitar thing, I was like, oh yeah, that's talking New York blues. So that's,
Yeah.
you know,
You referred to that story about Paul and his first reaction in '62 listening to Bob. I'm right, you got an opportunity to actually put that question to Paul if you recalled
yeah,
that comment.
yeah. And he said, you know, because Mike has written that down in he's written a couple of memoirs, but it's in the one, Thank You Very Much by Mike
Yes.
McCartney. It's where he tells that folk crap story. He's also expanded on it in a couple of podcast interviews, or actually only one podcast interview. So that's the kind of thing I was just digging for. You know, it's like Mike McCartney gave an interview in 2018 that he said something he'd never said before. And but I asked Paul, do you remember this, calling it folk crap? And he said, well, I might have done. I was very much into rock and roll at the time. And also what came up was that Mike had gotten the album from Celia Mortimer, who probably your listeners know is the woman who inspired I Saw Her Standing There.
Yes.
And Mike and Celia were going out at the time, and Celia was the one who was hip enough to be into Dylan for at the time of his first album, which was not a hit. So it was not the kind of record that most people would know about. And so Mike borrowed it from her, and so I mentioned that to Paul McCartney, and I said, I think Celia Mortimer gave it to Mike. He said, I said, she was Mike's girlfriend. He goes, I believe she was also my girlfriend for a while too. You know, I was like, so I was like, yeah, that was funny.
Were you able to do that interview first person, or was it done uh, across a line? How was that conducted?
It was just like this.
Yeah.
So we were on, you know, on the computer, although it wasn't, we had no screen. It wasn't Zoom, but it was a phone interview basically. So, and it was about an hour. So they told me, yeah, Paul will talk to you for 10 minutes, and I was just hoping that if he got into it, the topic, that he would keep going, which is what happened. So that was nice.
Yeah, congratulations. That's wonderful. It's important, I think you make the point that by the time we get to that mid part of the '60s, Bob has kind of crossed over, particularly in the UK, with some pop cred. He's kind of sharing
Hmm.
pop news and pop publications alongside the Beatles. By the time he gets over there and those Royal Albert Hall shows are coming around, he's very much well established in the UK, isn't he?
Yeah, but it's really by the time of his 1965 tour when he arrives there, that's he's got like three or four of his albums are in the top 10. So even his old stuff is coming back into the charts. And I think when he arrives, the song "The Times They Are a Changin'" from '63, you know, it's like 18 months after it came out. I think it's the number two single in Britain at the time. And then the album that was new for him at the time, which was Bringing It All Back Home, is already in the top 20 and it's going to go to number one. You know, so he's got four or five albums. And I believe the Freeway, I have to double check this, but it's something like this where Beatles for Sale is number one. And then the album that replaces it is, I believe, The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, one
Mm.
of his old albums, knocks the Beatles off the charts, which happens a bit later too with Help and Like a Rolling Stone are trading places in the charts a couple years later, or later that year. But yeah, there was a pretty good reception for him, and also he was mobbed and people tore at his clothes. And Dylan, people forget now, but he appeared in teen magazines for a couple years there, so he was kind of a pop star. And there was also the thing at the time that there was a move toward folk in the British charts. So aside from his rock and roll stuff, his folk stuff was coming back. Donovan was starting to make an impression with his like Catch the Wind, and
Mm.
there were other groups that had folky sound that were in the charts. And Lennon was annoyed by this, even though had written "You've Got to Hide Your Love Away" and also Norwegian Wood and some other songs like that. And there's a scene that I found in an old Melody Maker in '65, and Lennon is it's so funny because he's with a reporter in his limousine. They're driving to meet the other Beatles to go see a Michael Caine movie, and and um, "I'll Follow the Sun" comes on the radio, and Lennon
Huh.
gives this rant where he's like, "I suppose they think that's folk. How could it be folk? Paul wrote it when he was 10." Even though, I mean, Paul actually wrote it when he was 16, but it's just a funny line because he's all annoyed that this folk craze is coming, and what happened to good old rock and roll? Lennon keeps going back and forth in his mind
Yeah.
about that kind of thing. So
There's a piece there where you talk about 64, and I just want to share, looking over to some of my research points here, where again, some wonderful research that runs through your work, where you talk about a publication called Sing Out, sort of a pop culture magazine that was around at the time, and a letter to the editor, which I just thought was wonderful. It comes in from a reader. And she highlights that even then, and we're talking 64, she's highlighting that Dylan and Lennon have these remarkable similarities. Both play guitar, both play harmonica, both wear these Huck Finn caps, both express disdain for worldly things, both have a Chaplin-esque sense of humour, both write poetry, and asks at the end, could they be one and the same? I thought that was remarkable for the time, that a fan is already starting to sense this connective tissue so deeply. Did you find something like that kind of remarkable as well?
yeah, I did. And so there's that. And so that woman who wrote that letter, I believe her name was Eileen Strong. And there was this critic in San Francisco, Ralph J. Gleason, who had been a jazz critic in the 50s, but he fell for Dylan hard. And then he starts writing more about Dylan and other folk musicians. And then next falls he thinks the Beatles are incredible, so he also loves the Beatles. So he followed up that letter by writing a column where he said, "Are Bob Dylan and John Lennon the same person?" And so he mentions that letter in Sing Out magazine, and then he builds on it and he keeps going. And so his column was syndicated, so it was in papers all over the United States. And then the next Beatles tour in America, I think it's in or North America, I think it's in Toronto. A reporter asks John Lennon, um, "Are you and Bob Dylan the same person?" And John Lennon says, "Oh, I saw that. I saw that article." And it's funny what he says. He says, "No, we're not. Mind you, we could be." Which is really
That's
funny.
great.
Yeah. And then in one of the first articles about the Beatles in an American magazine by this guy Al Aronowitz, who turns out to be the guy who introduced Dylan to the Beatles, um, he writes, this is very early in like March '64, and he reported this during the Beatles' first visit to New York. And he says that if John Lennon had been born in the United States, he would have gravitated toward Greenwich Village, and he and Bob Dylan would have seen each other like mirror images down a hallway or something like that. So he's the first one I found to connect them, and then it comes up again and again. It's funny, even when Lennon gets when Lennon makes the movie How I Won the War, he has to get a haircut so he can play Private Gripweed. And then the the first reporter to see Lennon when he has his new haircut, he leaves a little bit on top, but it's pretty short. So the Beatles mop top is finally gone, right? And the first thing the reporter says is, "You look a little bit like Bob Dylan this way. Has anybody told you that?" And John Lennon says, "Yeah, a few people have told me that. It's because
Yeah.
it's sticking up on top, you know." But it's funny that it seems to be in people's minds to associate them with each other from early on.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And Al, I want to get the pronunciation on the surname right. Is it
Oh, yeah, Aronowitz. Yeah,
Aronowitz? Yeah, you sent me down a bit
yeah,
of a rabbit hole with him. I found
yeah.
his story seemed fascinating too. He seems like he was right on the pulse.
There are other journalists that people may know more from that era, um, but he's one of the greats who's kind of been a little forgotten. And he wrote two great pieces on the Beatles for the Saturday Evening Post, and which that may be part of the reason he's a little forgotten. They didn't appear in Rolling Stone or other magazines that have had more of an afterlife. People have kind of forgotten about the Saturday Evening Post, and he stayed friends with the Beatles and Dylan for into the 2000s. Well, he
Mm.
had a falling out with Dylan in the 80s, but even in the late 70s, Al Aronowitz became a serious drug addict and lost a lot of his money. And George Harrison gave him $50,000 as a loan. And Al Aronowitz writes about this, where he said, it was like a saintly thing for George to do because he was really having a hard time. He had kids to raise and stuff, and and he said George, gave it to me as a loan, knowing that I could never repay it, but he did it
Huh.
anyway. So
Yeah.
so he stayed in touch with George and all of them, and he was kind of the go-between between Dylan and the Beatles, and it was really his idea to get them to meet each other. He thought if they would meet, they would set off these creative sparks when they met each other. And he was kind of right, So
Yeah.
he had to convince Lennon, who didn't want to meet Dylan, weirdly, because Lennon was so in awe of Bob Dylan that he said, I can't meet him yet. I have to wait until I'm his ego equal, meaning, and then, um, and then when he says that, after that, the Beatles go to Australia, and that footage to me was mind blowing. Where I mean, truly hundreds of thousands of people
Yeah.
lining the
Some
streets,
quarter of
and
a million in Adelaide.
yeah,
Mm.
and then when the Beatles get back from that trip, that's when Lennon tells Al Aronowitz, "Yeah, I'm ready, to meet him." I think like when you've been adored by millions of people, maybe your self-esteem might go up a little bit. You'd hope so, so you could meet Bob Dylan.
What do we know about that meeting in terms of fact from myth? What were you able to sort of unearth there?
That's kind of a well-known story, so fans
Yeah.
probably know about the night Dylan met the Beatles, and it is true. But so there are about five or six first-person accounts. So what I did in writing about it was just to read all of those, make sure they agreed on the basic facts, and that So one is by Al Aronowitz, but his is kind of forgotten because it's in a self-published book that's hard to find. Then Dylan's other right-hand man, Victor Maimudis, he wrote a memoir that came out a few years ago. And then all of the Beatles have given interviews about this at some point. So you can pick up
Mm.
scraps from what they said. And I also interviewed a Beatles fan who was in the hotel that night. So she told me she was in the room right before Dylan arrived and told me what that was like, so I could kind of get a feeling for what the scene was there. And it is true that, I mean, people say Dylan turned the Beatles onto marijuana. That's not exactly true because the Beatles had smoked pot before that, at least John and George at some point in Liverpool, but I think they never really got the full effect. And then it's not exactly Dylan who brings the marijuana, it's Al Aronowitz and this other guy, Victor Mahmood, is there. Victor is the guy carrying the pot. Al Aronowitz was a big believer that marijuana was a drug of enlightenment at the time. Even though he was older, he was 35. He'd learned to smoke pot from Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg in the
Mm.
50s. So he'd been doing it for a while. And he was critical of the Beatles for doing, Purple Hearts and other amphetamines. He's like, you got to get off that synthetic stuff and try this. This is just before the hippie movement, but the same ideas are coming into being, so they did smoke pot, they had a good time. Dylan passed out. So that was it's a funny night. You think the main thing about it is, though, they did like each other, they were competitive with each other, the Beatles and Dylan. But I think meeting one another and liking one another helped this kind of creative dialogue they got into over the years.
Yeah.
And the thing that really surprised me, I knew about that night before I started researching this, but the next time the Beatles come to New York, Dylan is at their hotel room, a year later, on the first night that they are in town, and when the Beatles go to London, I mean, when Dylan goes to London, the Beatles go to his hotel room, over and over again. So anytime they have a chance to see each other, they did, which I don't think a lot of fans are even aware of.
Mm. There is this, you mentioned it just a moment ago there, this dialogue that begins between Dylan and the Beatles. And it's this thing that we see, and it's well documented just in recent times, the dialogue between Lennon and McCartney that goes on throughout their lives, communicating through song. George does it as well. It's a wonderful part of their story. When does that dialogue begin to happen between Lennon, McCartney, and Dylan? Because that starts pretty early on in the game too, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it starts soon after they fall for Dylan's music in early '64. And and I think both of them start challenging themselves to write, to go deeper in their lyrics and to not settle for things that they had before. So even McCartney, like I don't think there's no McCartney song that sounds like a Bob Dylan song, but when he writes something like even Drive My Car, that's a very elaborate scenario for a pop song. So it's a complex story, much of it told from a woman's point of view, and it's very different from She Loves You or
Hmm.
I Saw Her Standing There. So he's challenging himself to come up with more. And Lennon says at the end of 64 in an interview that he wrote I'm a Loser and also A Hard Day's Night, inspired by Dylan. So those are the first two songs that he cites as Dylan-esque kind of songs. And but I think it kind of informs their work. I think a thing like Things We Said Today is even uh, shows traces of a Dylan influence on McCartney's approach to songwriting.
Something that Bob even honours himself with the Art of McCartney project many years later when he covers it, right?
Yeah, that's a song, and it's funny because it does make sense for Dylan to sing that song. He did that. He did that song in 2014. Yeah.
This is one of the reveals for me in the book that I wasn't completely aware of, that even someone of the stature of Maureen Cleave writes at the time of the Beatles for Sale album and is talking about that. And she writes, one might hope that John Lennon soon ceases to be so influenced by Bob Dylan. So it's obviously on the ears of people. And she was obviously no slouch and was deeply in the inner circle at that time. So she's picking up that as well, isn't she?
She really is, and that's even before Lennon gives that interview to Melody Maker saying that. So she picked up on that, and I think to her, she really liked that the early fun Beatles, and they were so refreshing to people and so much fun that I think she saw them. You hear a song like "Babies in Black," and suddenly the Beatles are singing about death. And I think for some listeners, they're like, "Wait a minute, what's happening here?" These guys were supposed to bring fun and good cheer into our lives, and a beat, and here they are playing in 3/4 time and singing about you know a widow. so
Yeah, yeah.
so so it took some getting used to for the fans of that time.
I know you might be a little weary of talking about it because I've been listening to some of your pods in recent weeks, but I have to ask because I love the way that you sort of recount this story around fourth time around with Dylan and him kind of calling the Beatles out in a very clear way musically that doesn't go unnoticed by the band recording it in the studio with them, doesn't go unnoticed in the culture.
Yeah, so when Dylan heard the song Norwegian Wood, he was kind of aghast because he thought, oh my Lord, they're doing it again. So he was, it seems that he was aware of the Melody Maker interview, so he knew that Lennon had said that two songs were written uh, for the Beatles that were inspired by Dylan. Then came You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, which even George Martin said when they were recording it, John, would you mind not sounding so much like Dylan on this one? And then Norwegian Wood comes out on Rubber Soul, and Dylan heard it, and he thought things had gone too far. So when he starts at the early in the sessions of Blonde on Blonde, he writes this song while the guys in his band are waiting around. They're like union musicians who are, highly paid. And then he finally comes up with a song, and when he debuts it for the other musicians in the studio, one of them, Al Cooper, says, what's up with this song? It sounds so much like Norwegian Wood. And Dylan says, no, I'm afraid Norwegian Wood sounds like a Bob Dylan song. They've taken it from me, and I feel that I must repay them. That's not the exact quote, but something
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that.
It sounds like
So
it. Yeah.
then, yeah. So then a couple months later, Dylan's in London, and Dylan and the Beatles are meeting a lot at the Mayfair Hotel in Dylan's suite, and they're playing for each other advanced copies of Blonde on Blonde and Revolver of the songs from both of those. Isn't that amazing? Those two albums are just in the works at the time. And when Dylan plays this song that he wrote fourth time around that has the same melody as Norwegian Wood, basically the same, Lennon can't believe what he's hearing, and he turns to McCartney, he says, "This sounds like it ought to be on Northern Songs," and referring to their publishing company. And Dylan goes, "What's Northern Songs?" And Lennon doesn't tell him, and then a few weeks later, Dylan gets John to agree to appear in this documentary he's making, and so John gets in the back of a limo with Dylan while D.A. Pennebaker is filming them.
Eat the
And the
document. Yeah.
thing, yeah, eat the document. And so people might know about this limo ride footage. And the thing that you kind of, as I watched it over and over again, that, the first couple times I saw this footage, a long time ago, because it kind of circulates as a bootleg or you might see it on YouTube, it kind of made me cringe because it seems like they're talking in gibberish and it's a bunch of two guys kind of flexing for each other, but once I knew every little thing they were talking about after kind of steeping myself in the world of 1966, it began to make more sense. And then I think I could see that he had a goal in mind in this conversation, which was to get at this issue about who ripped off whom. So about midway through the limo ride, he brings it up to Lennon and I was pissed off about something. And he's like, that thing you said at the Mayfair when what was that? What's the name of your song? I didn't know what you meant by the thing you said. And Robbie told me you were talking about your song publishing company. What's the name of it? And Lennon tries to get out of it, but finally he says, do you mean Northern Songs? And Dylan's like, yeah, that's it, Northern Songs. You turned to Paul and he said, he's like, what did you mean by that? So he wants to get Lennon to say like, if Lennon says, well, I think your song ripped me off, then Dylan can say, but I wrote it because you've already ripped me off 3 times before, or something like that, so, to really get into the issue. But instead of going into it, Lennon does this kind of hilarious comedy bit, and everybody laughs, and it's kind of over. So this was like a moment of tension between them about, who owes whom or something like that creatively. But they were still close enough that, that night all four Beatles saw Dylan play at the Albert Hall. And when the hecklers were booing Dylan, the four Beatles were yelling at everybody to shut up and saying, leave him alone, So,
Yeah. Am I right that he apparently received a message from them? The booing didn't matter, the music did.
yeah.
Yeah.
So Robbie Robertson writes about that
Yeah.
when they're in the limo on the way back, I guess it was a note from the Beatles that said the booing didn't matter, the music did. Yeah.
Yeah, you gave me context for that limo ride, which I was very grateful for because up until that moment, I'm like, I had nothing to kind of ground myself with watching that to find anything beyond what you'd said at the beginning. It seems to be gibberish and two guys that are probably coming off a 24-hour run of whatever they're doing. But there is
Yeah.
story in there in the way that they are dealing with each other, which I just thought was really fascinating.
Yeah.
As you,
Another funny thing to me about that is the it's just the night before the Beatles are recording the Yellow Submarine. It's just kind of funny to me that that's the first night of doing Yellow Submarine. And I do make a connection between that song and the people might know the song Rainy Day Women, which is
yeah,
Everybody Must Get Stoned by Bob Dylan. And that was in the top 10 when the Beatles recorded Yellow Submarine. And there are really only two songs of 1966 that have kind of a marching band in them and, Oompa, Salvation Army horns and that kind of stuff. And
huh.
so I think Yellow Submarine has a small debt to Rainy Day Women.
Yeah, there you go. And without getting into spoiler territory for people that haven't yet dived into the book, but I did want to unpack a little bit about a 1985, if I have that right, interview with Dylan, where there's reference to sitting with John in Kenwood and maybe even putting something down on a tape recorder. And I just thought that was, I'd never heard anything like that before. What do
Yeah,
you
this
think
is
of
one of
that?
these Yeah, there's one of these little things that are lost. So, since I was on this trail of trying to get all their interactions and just get them straight and what happened, and this is kind of another thing that's kind of hiding in plain sight that Dylan gave this interview in 1985 where he said he went to John Lennon's house. So this is the tour. If people know the Dylan documentary, Don't Look Back, it's when he's still a solo artist. He's playing 7 or 8 shows in England, and in between shows, he goes to Kenwood, and and Lennon would write songs a lot up on the third floor where he had his own reel-to-reel tape player, and he had a toy car track and guitars and all this stuff. And in his interview, Dylan tells Cameron Crowe, was the interviewer in
Mm,
1985, that, and he specifically refers to it as a song. He doesn't say we were just jamming. He says, we were working on a song. I know the tape recorder was on. I don't know what it was, but I know that I know it was recorded. So I don't think it's impossible that that could turn up one day because I don't think all of Lennon's stuff has been archived and cataloged at this point. So even though I'm sure people have trawled through everything to get archival tracks onto all these box sets,
Hmm.
that would be a real treasure if it's still out there and is discovered one of these days.
Yeah,
Who knows? It could be junk, but it would be interesting. Even if it was bad, it would be interesting to hear it.
yeah.
So,
Well, we
so
had that
yeah,
great revelation with the deluxe box set release for Revolver, where you hear the what becomes Yellow Submarine with John with an acoustic guitar doing
yeah,
something completely unique and that's almost working class hero like, you know.
yeah.
And I didn't even know that existed until the moment, like millions of others. Quite remarkable.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing transformation of a song where I think if Lennon had been able to figure out how to complete that song, because really he only had kind of a wisp of a song, that and it's so desperately sad, the
Mm.
original Yellow Submarine. And then Paul at the same time is like, we need something for Ringo to sing. And then Paul has this, while he's falling asleep one night, has this little vision of a band of merrymakers out on the sea. And then since Lennon can't finish that song, I think, and they get together and he says, well, let's turn this into something we can use as opposed to just having this 45-second very depressing scrap of music, which
Yeah,
actually I loved the original version of it.
yeah.
But it's very weird. I wondered if, Lennon never said later, like, oh, you ruined my song. You took
Mm.
my heartfelt cry of pain and turned it into a children's story. He doesn't, I think he kind of understood that that song, what he couldn't get it done the way it was. So I think he let Paul take it in a new direction. But
Yeah,
it's really interesting what happened. It shows a lot about their collaboration, that
yeah.
Yellow Submarine, how that went from that original Lennon scrap into a completed song.
I agree. It's a great example of the sandpaper and honey that is
Yeah,
Lennon and McCartney. You know,
yeah, true.
there's a wonderful acknowledgement of that very special relationship between George and Bob, which always kind of surprised me. It's not like it becomes Paul and Bob, the writers, the writers in, inside inverted commas, but this beautiful relationship that forms with George and Bob is quite remarkable. There's a lovely quote where Bob says, to George, it's known, you write incredible lyrics. And to which Bob, I beg your pardon, yeah, George says to Bob, and Bob responds, well, how do you write those tunes? This little recollection that they have there, this conversation, seems to be very insightful about what might have been the attraction between the two. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think Dylan admired, one thing he said from the beginning was he kept talking about the outrageous chords that the Beatles used. And we know that that's George. He had a lot of inventive chords that he would, you could give him a Lennon McCartney melody, and I think he would come up with chords that were not necessarily the ones that Paul told him to play. They were, his own setting for those vocal melodies. And there are those stories, that George learned those jazz chords from who is there? There's a guy in a record shop in Liverpool, and there was also a former ship hand who showed George some of these,
Yeah.
jazzy chords and things like that. And and so I think Dylan liked that. And as Dylan developed as a guitar player, other guitar players like Tom Petty and other people have talked about how adept he is as a rhythm player and as somebody who can, you can say to Dylan, you know, C major ninth, whatever, diminished, and he can do it. You know what I mean? Like he can, and
Yeah.
also he can transpose songs. He can play a song in one key, switch it to another key, and with no, it's not a problem for him. I think people think of Dylan as kind of a very basic guitar player, but I think he's beyond that. And maybe it was at this time with George where, he took this next, went to this next level. And they wrote songs together. They met in Dylan's home near Woodstock, New York, in Thanksgiving 1968. And aside from the thing we talked about with John Lennon, this is really one of the rare times that Dylan wrote face to face with somebody else. They wrote
Mm-hmm.
these two songs together. Before this, Dylan, if he collaborated, he would give lyrics to someone else, like someone in the band, and they would write melodies for it. But with George, they sat together and they wrote I'll Have You Anytime, and they tried to complete this song called Maureen that was based on a McCartney melody for the song Thingamabob. People might know that one.
Yeah.
The first Apple Records release. Yeah.
I loved you asking, I don't want to give too much away, of course, but little
That's
spoiler
okay.
alert. But I loved you asking Paul about that and getting a sense that he found that a bit of a revelation.
Yeah, so I said, do you remember the song you wrote, Thingamabob? And Paul, I think he's always glad to be asked about the obscurities. He's like,
Yeah.
yes, I remember that. When I said, well, did you know that, that George and Bob tried to write a song based on the melody of Thingamabob? And he was seemed very happy to hear it. So that was nice. And it was nice that it was kind of a revelation to him,
Yeah.
as was when I mentioned that George was at the session where Dylan recorded Yesterday in 1970, and
Yeah.
Paul didn't seem to be aware of that either. Yeah.
I think what I found really wonderful about your questions to Paul, I can only imagine when someone sits down to ask Paul anything, how do you come at that without asking anything he's heard a million times before and get something fresh? How do you possibly do that? And then as I'm reading your questions, I'm thinking, oh, you're doing it point for point for point. It's no small thing to be able to do that. And then, as you mentioned at the start of our conversation, you get him from an agreed 10 minutes into an hour. I'm sure that's based on the quality of the questions and the nature of your inquiry.
Thanks. I think it does help. Yeah, if someone like him hears something they've heard a million times before, they're going to get bored and leave the conversation. So, but there were things there were kind of anybody would have thought to ask him who's interested in this subject. For instance, people know that Paul and Bob saw each other in 2016 at this desert trip festival in California. They were both on the bill, so it's just natural to ask, like, Paul, did you see Dylan's show when he played there? And luckily he did, and he had a whole story to tell about it that he hadn't told before. So that's the kind of thing. And I think he's glad to be asked something that he hasn't been asked before and tell his Bob Dylan story. It's fun to tell a Bob Dylan story. Everybody's
Yeah.
got one,
Yeah.
and yeah. So I think from when I asked him about that experience they had in California, he was happy to talk. And also, people don't know that when Paul was making Ram in New York in 1971, that his family and Dylan's family spent a lot of time together. So he was happy to talk about that. They went to Dylan's house. And the way I asked that was I noticed in Linda's book of photographs that there's this lovely portrait of Dylan. And then I noticed, I forget, you kind of sleuth backwards, and I've realized it was at his townhouse in New York. And I said, oh, they must have been there. And then found other photos online from that same photo shoot. So I was hoping that they made music together, Paul and Bob at the townhouse on McDougal Street, but Paul didn't recall making music. But he did recall, yeah, we would go down there with the kids, and Bob would come up to the Stanhope Hotel and spend time with us. So they saw a lot of each other, especially around that time.
Yeah, that's a great little insight into your process. When you see a photograph in a book and then you start to dig
Yeah.
in, and that investigative process that you had there is a really remarkable thing. I read what I think was a quote from you online somewhere where you were talking about your process some time ago and saying that you love a good tale. You like something that's got some
Yeah.
conflict and drama. And how does it feel knowing this book now is out in the world? How do you feel knowing that, I guess it's almost no longer yours because it becomes ours in some way, doesn't it? It's a contribution back into Beatles history. And how does
I
it
hope
feel for you?
so. I hope people like it and enjoy it. It's funny that you mentioned that. I've interviewed other people for, magazine stories and other stories. It reminds me of, I interviewed Nick Lowe. I really like him a lot.
So do
And
I.
he said something about songwriting to me where he said, it feels like to me the song is finished when I can play it and it sounds like somebody else wrote it.
Huh.
That's when he knows it's finished. He's like, it's almost like somebody else wrote it. It's so good that and so that's what I almost tried to get the book that way. It's like I could just pick it off the shelf and be like, oh, this looks interesting. I wonder what this is all about. So I think when Nick Lowe writes something like Cruel to Be Kind or even, Lonesome Reverie, those newer songs that if they just sound like inevitable, like somebody had to write this song, that then Nick Lowe feels like now it's finished. It doesn't sound like it's a page from my diary. It sounds like something
Yeah.
been worked up and people can use.
Yeah,
So
that's beautiful. You write in the book, Dylan and the Beatles remain a big part of cultural life 6 decades after their breakthroughs, but they are little by little passing into history, and it's so true. And that's why work like this is important. There's a sense for me that this is where Beatles authorship has to go. It has to go in this direction. And you're right there at the tip of the spear.
thanks a lot. It's nice to hear. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.